In the autumn of 1973, Queen were offered a support slot on a British tour. The band headlining was Mott the Hoople, one of the most respected and commercially successful rock acts in Britain at that moment. A band whose 1972 single, All the Young Dudes, had been one of the defining hits of the glam rock era, and whose touring reputation was that of a band that commanded audiences. Queen were the support act. This was not an unusual arrangement, and it was not presented as an opportunity. It was presented as a favor, a slot made available, partly because another act had dropped out, and partly because Queen's management had pressed for inclusion. Nobody in the Mott the Hoople camp was particularly interested in Queen. Nobody in the touring infrastructure expected Queen to be remarkable. They were the opening act. They would play before the lights were fully up, before the audience was fully seated, before anyone in the room had decided to care. What happened instead every night across the length of that tour was that Queen took the stage and did something that nobody had instructed them to do and nobody had anticipated. They stole the show. Not occasionally. Not on the nights when the room was particularly receptive. Every night. Brian May has said this with the specific directness of someone reporting a fact rather than making a claim. He has said, "We were stealing shows." And after enough shows had been stolen, Mott the Hoople asked Queen to do something. They asked them to tone it down. In autumn 1973, Queen had released their debut album 7 months earlier. The album had attracted some critical attention, but had not produced a commercial breakthrough. They were working musicians in the specific sense of musicians, building a career from the ground up. Freddie Mercury was 27. Brian May was 26. Roger Taylor was 24. John Deacon was 22, the youngest. Quiet, precise, the bassist who underpinned everything the other three did. The specific Queen sound the layered vocals, the orchestral guitar approach, the theatrical drama of Freddie Mercury's stage persona was already fully formed. It had not yet found an audience large enough to reflect its scale back to them. The Mott the Hoople tour was a platform, rooms large enough to test what the sound could do at scale. They tested it every night. Mott the Hoople in autumn 1973 were at an interesting point in their trajectory. All the Young Dudes, the David Bowie penned single that had rescued them in 1972, had given them a new audience and commercial position. Their touring operation was professional and well organized. The apparatus of a band that knew how to put on a show that sent audiences home satisfied. The dynamic of the headliner-support relationship in British touring was well established. The support act warmed up the audience and left the stage having done enough to be useful without having done so much that the headliner faced a deflated crowd. The support act was a service function. It was not supposed to be the event. Queen had been brought onto the tour to perform the service function. What they performed instead was a systematic demonstration every night of what happened when a band of their quality and theatrical ambition was given a stage and an audience. A systematic demonstration every night of what happened when this band was given a stage and an audience. Brian May has described the experience of those shows from the inside, the specific quality of playing, to rooms that were not yet warmed up for Queen, rooms that had come to see Mott the Hoople, rooms that were in the specific state of readiness for a headline act, and that found themselves in the opening act set in a state of readiness for something they had not come expecting. He has said that the energy in those rooms was something they felt building in real time. The audience's resistance, the specific protective indifference of people who had not chosen to invest their attention in the opening act, dissolving as the set progressed. Not gradually, quickly, in the specific way that resistance dissolves when it encounters something that makes resistance irrelevant. And every night, when Queen came off the stage, the Mott the Hoople team were dealing with the specific problem of following an opening act that had left the audience in a state usually associated with the conclusion of a headline performance. The shows Queen played on the Mott the Hoople tour have been described consistently exceptional. Freddie Mercury's stage presence in a 30 to 40-minute opening set was the stage presence of someone who had no concept of warming up. He came onto the stage as if the audience had already given him everything and was waiting to receive it back. The command was immediate. The relationship between performer and audience that Freddie Mercury established, making 2,000 people feel that their full attention was the natural and correct response, was not something that scaled down for a support slot. It was simply what he did. The band behind him matched it. Brian May's guitar playing made professional musicians in the audience stop and pay attention. Roger Taylor's drumming provided the physical force that drove the performance. John Deacon's bass held everything together with the invisible precision that good bass playing provides. The sum of the four of them on a stage in front of a room that had not come to see them was more than the room had expected. Mott the Hoople noticed what was happening. The evidence was in the crowds. Not unfriendly, the audiences had not become hostile to their headliner, but changed. More fully awake, more fully present than they would have been if the opening act had performed the service function it was supposed to perform. This created a specific problem. The audience had been given a very high reference point by the opening act and were applying it to everything that followed. The accounts from the Mott the Hoople camp are careful and not unkind. They acknowledge what Queen were doing without pretending it was not making their own job harder. At some point in the tour, someone from the Mott the Hoople side communicated something to Queen. The substance, as Brian May has described it, was that Queen should consider dialing back the intensity of their shows. Brian May has described Queen's response to the request with the specific directness of someone reporting a fact they find mildly amusing in retrospect. They did not tone it down. They decided collectively, in the way Queen made decisions, that toning it down was not something they were willing to do. Not out of disrespect for Mott the Hoople, whose music they admired, but out of the conviction that had brought them this far, that what they were doing was what they were supposed to be doing, and that the appropriate response to being asked to do it less was to continue doing it at the same level. The shows continued. The stealing continued. And Brian May, reflecting on this period years later, has said, "We knew what we were, even before the world knew it. We knew. And every night on that stage, in front of rooms that had come to see someone else, we showed them. We knew what we were, even before the world knew it." This is the specific quality of the Mott the Hoople tour that makes it significant beyond the anecdote. It was not simply that Queen played well as an opening act. It was that Queen played as if they were not an opening act, as if the specific context of the support slot, with all its institutional signals about hierarchy and appropriate scale, was a context that applied to other bands and not to them. They had been told their music was too complex for radio. They had been rejected by the major labels. They were the opening act that nobody had particularly wanted, and every night they walked onto the stage and played as if none of those things were true, with the result that by the time they walked off, the audience had also stopped believing that any of those things were true. The audiences who saw Queen on the Mott the Hoople tour were experiencing something that had not yet been packaged or promoted. There was no Bohemian Rhapsody to prime expectation. There was simply a band on a stage, a set of songs, and Freddie Mercury at the front of it. People who saw Queen on that tour have described an experience that could not be accounted for by any information they had going in. They had come to see Mott the Hoople. They left talking about the opening act. Not because the opening act was commercially better known, but because the opening act had, in a 30-minute set, made the kind of impression most artists spend entire careers trying to make, that this band existed on a different scale from what the context suggested was possible, that the stage was too small for what they were doing, and that the world was going to have to accommodate itself to what Queen were rather than the other way around. The Mott the Hoople tour was followed by the release of 7 Seas of Rye in February 1974, Queen's first UK chart entry, reaching number 10. The connection between the 1973 touring exposure and the 1974 commercial breakthrough is not incidental. The audiences who had seen Queen had gone home and talked. When 7 Seas of Rye appeared on top of the pops, there were already people who had seen Queen on a stage and who were waiting for the commercial confirmation of what they had witnessed. The chart entry was not a surprise to those people, it was a recognition. The opening act that had stolen shows in autumn 1973 was now demonstrably the kind of act that charts in the top 10. The progression felt inevitable to anyone who had been in those rooms. Brian May has spoken about the Mott the Hoople tour across multiple interviews. He has said the experience of playing those shows was one of the formative experiences of Queen's identity as a live band, that the challenge of establishing a relationship with an audience that had not come to see them taught them something about what they could do and how quickly they could do it. He has said that Freddie Mercury's ability to take a room that was not yet his and make it his within the first 30 seconds of the opening song was something he observed on every show and has never stopped thinking about. He has also said directly, without embellishment, that they were stealing shows. This phrase is not a boast, it is a description. The shows were being stolen in the sense that the opening act was taking something that belonged to the headliner, the audience's primary attention for the evening, and keeping it for themselves. The shows were being stolen in the specific sense that the opening act was taking something that belonged to the headliner and keeping it for themselves. Brian May has said this. He has said it clearly, without apology, as a fact about what happened on that tour. And the fact is significant not simply as an anecdote about a specific tour, but as a window into what Queen were before the world had decided what Queen were. The decision about what Queen were the commercial and critical consensus that would eventually settle around them as one of the most significant rock bands of their era was still years away in autumn 1973. But every person in every room where they stole a show had already made that decision for themselves, in the specific and personal way that audiences make decisions when they have been given no choice but to pay attention. The tour ended and Queen continued. Queen 2 was released in March 1974. Killer Queen charted at number 2 in 1974. Bohemian Rhapsody was number 1 for 9 weeks in 1975. By 1976, they were filling arenas. By 1977, they were on the cover of Newsweek. The trajectory from support act to global rock institution took approximately 4 years. The foundation was laid in the specific autumn of 1973 in a series of British theaters by a band that had been asked to fill a supporting role and had declined night after night to be confined to it. They stole the shows. They kept what they stole. And the world eventually adjusted its understanding of Queen's size to match what Queen had always understood their size to be. Mott the Hoople's relationship with what Queen were doing is, in the testimony of people present, complicated in the specific way that genuine admiration and professional inconvenience are complicated when directed at the same object. The people in the Mott the Hoople camp were not small-minded. They could see what Queen were. But they were a working band with a headlining show to deliver after the extraordinary thing had happened, and the extraordinary thing was not making their job easier. The request to tone it down was a professional request, made in the context of a professional touring operation. That Queen did not comply is entirely consistent with what Queen were. You did not ask Queen to tone it down, not because they would refuse angrily, but because the thing that made them worth asking was the same thing that made it impossible to do what was being asked. You did not ask Queen to tone it down. The thing that made them worth asking was the same thing that made it impossible to do what was being asked. This is the specific quality that the Mott the Hoople tour revealed, not simply that Queen was good, but that Queen was the kind of good that could not be adjusted to fit the context. The context would have to adjust to them. It did. It took 4 years. But the adjusting began in those rooms in autumn 1973, in front of audiences that had come to see someone else every night, until Brian May could say clearly and without exaggeration, we were stealing shows. In autumn 1973, Queen were the support act. They were the opening act nobody had particularly wanted, given a slot because another band had dropped out, and their management had pressed for inclusion. They played 30 to 40 minutes before Mott the Hoople took the stage, in rooms where the audience had not come to see them. And every night they stole the show. Brian May has said this. He has said it with the directness of someone stating a fact. We were stealing shows. The headliner asked them to tone it down. They did not tone it down. The tour ended. 7 Seas of Rye charted in 1974. Killer Queen charted in 1975. Bohemian Rhapsody was number 1 for 9 weeks. The Wembley concerts happened. The Magic Tour happened. The world arrived gradually but completely at the understanding of what Queen were, the understanding that every audience member who saw them in autumn 1973 had reached within the first 30 seconds of the opening song. They were not an opening act that became a headline act. They were a headline act that happened for one specific autumn to be playing in the opening slot. The rooms found that out quickly. Mott the Hoople found that out a little more slowly and a little more personally, but everyone found it out eventually. You did not ask Queen to tone it down. You adjusted.